Is that the motion be agreed to, and I call the member for Melbourne Ports.
Very much, Acting Speaker. Despite his cigar buddy, the member for North Sydney, repeatedly calling for full privatisation of the government's remaining assets, in late May, Finance Minister Matthias Cormann begrudgingly said the Abbott government has no plans to sell Australia Post. Considering the number of backflips by this government on key policy promises, I don't find the minister's claim reassuring. Over the last year or so, a number of well-placed articles have pointed that Australia Post has more than $4 billion in assets and that selling it off would be a nice windfall for this allegedly cash-strapped government. It would also be a great asset strip for some unknown Sydney merchant bankers. The Australia Post Chairman Stanhope and the Business Council of Australia are, of course, in favour of this privatisation. What's more important, though, is that the ideological brains trust of this government, the Tea Party libertarians of the Institute for Public Affairs, have argued that there's no sound rationale for Australia Post to stay in government hands. We all remember the great powwow at the Arts Centre in Melbourne, attended by Rupert Murdoch and all the knobs in the now government, to honour the IPA last year, where all of this was lauded and organised. We've seen the Attorney-General Brandis's kamikaze mission to developed by the IPA to dump 18C. When the IPA says jump, the government says how high, and would you like a highly paid commissioner with that? When it's considered politically opportune, we'll hear from Minister Cormann saying hasta la vista to Australia Post. In the last few weeks, it's become even more obvious that the ground is being prepared for privatisation. The pig is being fattened. We've been told by the Australia Post CEO that because Australians are sending fewer letters, the letter delivery side of Australia Post's operations is bleeding money. Thus, to avoid so-called extinction, Australia Post workforce is being reduced by 900, with Communications Minister Turnbull seeming to agree with these reductions, and Australia Post Services which has been advocated to be reduced to 3 times a week. Probably most people don't realise that communicating via mail is less important than it was. In my view, the IPA Australia Post narrative has not nearly been as questioned to the extent that it should be. I say this because, despite popular perceptions, Australia Post is profitable overall. Last year it made $312 million. The organisation returned a dividend to the government of $244 million and paid taxes of $44.7 million. These profits have come overwhelmingly from the delivery of parcels, so the losses in the mail delivery side of the business, $218 million, were picked up by the parcel side, $648 million. Conveniently for privatisation purposes, Australia Post parcel delivery services undertaken by a wholly owned company, Star Trek Express. Separating Australia Post business in this way helps enable the argument that Australia Post is a sinking behemoth in need of radical surgery, potentially followed by privatisation. But what's the driving rationale if overall Australia Post is still providing healthy dividends to the government? Mr Murdoch's tabloid newspapers famously cross-subsidise his flagship, The Australian. Why is it so absurd for one arm of government service to provide in a provider like Australia Post to cross-subsidise another, particularly when we're all paying taxes for that major service? Australia Post and Mr Turnbull are concerned about reducing costs. I can suggest where they could turn. The Australia Post CEO earns $4.75 million last year. By contrast, the CEO of Royal Mail has paid $2.14 million. As recently as 2012, the US Postmaster General Donoghue received $512,000, a figure that was decried in the US despite the fact that he's running a $65 billion business. The Australia Post CEO is not the only higher-paid executive of Australia Post. There are currently, Acting Speaker, 435 Australia Post senior employees earning more than $193,000, 3 times as many individuals as there are MPs in the federal parliament, and they don't get the 3-year interview. It's a total of more than $120 million spent on the CEO and his senior employees each year. If Australians were aware of how profitable this 205-year-old institution is and how much its senior executives are earning, I'm sure they'd be disgusted at the arguments to cut its mail services and talk of eventual privatisation. They might ask the Minister of Communications why they pay taxes if they're going to be denied these services. Instead of considering the public interest, however, the IPA, the Australia Post leadership and the Terminator faction in the Liberal Party are pursuing a singly ideological agenda against Australia Post that's not in the public interest.
I thank the member for Melbourne Ports. The question is the motion be agreed to, and I call the member